Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the toxicology Inside Look podcast, where I share inspiring stories of budoka around the world. Please share your favorite episodes with your dojo and community so this effort can be spread to more corners of the earth. This episode is brought to you by our amazing patrons over at Patreon. By donating as little as a cup of coffee to a bowl of ramen, they've directly made this podcast possible. If you're enjoying this work and can spare a small tip each month, it would mean a lot to me. I'll also be sharing the occasional behind-the-scenes clips and side initiatives that build on this podcast. You can find it at www.patreon.com/Tokuskai Canada. Thanks in advance for your support. And now, on to the interview.
Okay. Now, this lecture that I've got here is actually a lecture with three different physiological adaptations of birds, respiration being the main one, but there's another one if we have time on adaptations of seabirds. And now you guys had a talk on free diving, so you might find it does have references to breathing in it a fair bit actually, but there's some other stuff that I can just skip over or whatever. But we'll see if we have time for that or not. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So here we go. If you're now, I realize you guys are all specialists in human breathing or whatever, and the fact is, if you look at this slide here, humans and birds, and along with the birds, some dinosaurs have very, very, very different breathing systems, as you're going to find out. And even just to start with right away, if you look at the bottom right-hand two pictures, you'll see the bronchi and the alveoli of a human lung there, looking very much like a branch of a tree, and then and it's a dead end thing as well. You'll see, and that's a very important concept to remember. And then on the right you have a bird lung, looking like that, and they're extremely different. Just a second. And so to start with, the functions of the avian respiratory system are not just for the purpose of breathing. First of all, yes, they do provide oxygen. It does provide oxygen to the blood, and yes, it does remove carbon dioxide from the blood, but it also eliminates heat from the body because birds have a very high metabolic rate. And you can imagine like a hummingbird, for example, that's flying around with its wings beating up to, what the heck is the, something like several hundred times a second. It's going to create a lot of heat. So the avian respiratory system, which includes lungs and air sacs, eliminates heat from the body. And then there's another function of the avian respiratory system, that's streamlining. And I'll explain that right now. If you look at this picture of a drawing of a gull, well, you guys would call it a seagull, but I would call it a gull. And you look at the whole sort of streamlined feature of this bird from the beak right down to the back of its feet here. Can you see this?
Yep. Your mouse cursor, yes.
I made it bigger in yellow so you could, because I'm going to need it a lot in this talk. And so if you look at this whole system here, it's kind of elongated. And if you look down below, you'll see a drawing of a reptile lung, which is somewhat like ours, like a dead end thing with the alveoli and the bronchi coming down. And then if you look at the avian lung, the airflow is unidirectional, going from front to back. And down in here, this area here, those are the parabronchi of the lung. I'll explain all this in a second. So that's sort of what the streamlining function is all about. And in terms of the anatomy of the system, I've always believed in starting at the top and working my way down. So the larynx in the bird is basically a bunch of partly ossified cartilages. They're not fully like hard bone like we have. They're partly ossified. And it's basically a cylindrical box, and there are no vocal cords in it. What the birds use for singing is a thing called the syrinx, which is found down into the trachea. What the larynx does for us, it helps us to make sounds, whereas in birds, it controls airflow into the trachea. And then to prevent food items and so on and liquids getting into the respiratory tract, they have a thing called the glottis. You can see it in that picture there, right? This thing right here, that closes off. And I usually tell people who are hand feeding birds, birds for whatever reason. Maybe they're a rehabilitation specialist taking in birds that are in trouble, whatever, or maybe they're a captive breed person, and they're giving maybe a syringe, no needle on it, with some sort of a Nutrical supplement or whatever, or liquids, to make sure that they put it down the throat beyond that thing. Otherwise, you could kill the bird by putting liquids or food into there and plugging up their trachea. So the avian trachea is very different between birds and humans. The trachea in birds is basically made of fully round cartilaginous rings, and in us, they're C-shaped. And then in birds, these things later become ossified. Not in all birds, but most birds. I can't tell you which ones it is and which ones it isn't and why that is, but not in mammals. They are. And the other thing about, if you look at the picture on the right there, down here, they're made to be collapsible, to shrink or stretch for various purposes, which you'll find out in a second. So here's a picture of the trachea right here, and then here's ours, this sort of C-shaped thing right here. It's a muscle at the top.
Sorry, question?
Yeah.
What's the significance of the difference between C-shaped and fully rounded?
That is a good question to ask. It may have something to do with what I'm about to tell you. Okay, because we have a larynx, but birds have a syrinx. But if you look at this picture here, this is a whooping crane. A bird like a heron with big long legs and a huge long neck. And if you look at their trachea here, there's the larynx up at the top here, and then here is the trachea going here and snaking all the way through the bird like this to go toward the lungs. Very different. This is not common. This is only found in long neck birds like egrets and herons and cranes and so on. And in another adaptation of the trachea in ducks, some waterfowl species like this redhead here, they have this extension sticking out, or diverticulum, and it's called a tracheal bulla. And I've actually had dissection classes with my ornithology students over the years, and when we dissected a duck, I always told them to look for the bulla. And it's actually quite a hard thing too. It's you can't compress it with your hand. It's bone. It's almost like bone. And the purpose of this thing, and it hasn't been well studied, is has nothing to do with this famous yogurt called Bulla Light Sour Cream. It has everything to do with being used in some way for vocalizations. Like maybe it could be, I don't know whether it's an echo chamber or whatever, but somehow they use this tracheal bulla to amplify sounds. And if you look at the trachea overall in birds, there are basically 3 different adaptations that we know of. First of all, there's the vocalizations known as bugle calls. And if you go back to this bird right here, the whooping crane, those birds make, like Canada geese, make a bugling call. And they're able to do that with this elongated trachea. And so that is one of the functions to help them make the bugle calls. And also, a lot of those large birds with long necks do long distance, not all, but like whooping cranes certainly do long distance, high altitude flight. And apparently it helps them in warming of inhaled air. I can't tell you how that is, but I guess the body heat inside the bird, and they've got all that air coming in there and sitting there in the, it has to go all the way through that long trachea, so it gets warmed up while the bird's flying. And then finally, the bird also can store air in that big long trachea too, probably needing that for its long distance flights. Now, the lungs are very, very different, as I said earlier to you, in birds. They are basically smallish. They are flattened as opposed to sort of round and 3D-ish like they are in humans. And they're also, in most birds, somewhat quadrilateral in shape. They have 4 sides to them. They're not a square. They're more of and they're not even a straight rectangle. They're just 4 sides to them, but a little bit weird shape. I'm going to show you a picture in a second. And these things are found, very interestingly, they're not sitting there just inside the bird's main body cavity. They are actually positioned dorsally. So if you had a dead bird laying on its back and you opened it up and moved, the pectoral muscles and everything out of the way to see the heart and the various digestive organisms, the lungs look like kind of frothy pink material, and a quarter of the volume of the lungs are actually, and there's two of them, two lungs, are situated between the ribs of the bird, like right up against the back. But it kind of looks like a frothy, almost like a strawberry mousse material, if I had to describe it. And they're not lobed as they are in our lungs. And the other thing about birds, but if you opened that bird up, you would never see them because these things are so diaphanous, you can't even see them there. And if they're not blown up, and they wouldn't be in a dead bird, they have about 8 to 10 air sacs. It varies with the various species and so on. And I'm going to be talking a lot about how the lungs and the air sacs work together to help birds breathe. And here's a picture right here. You can see this strawberry mousse or frothy material right here. Those are the two lungs. And as I said, a quarter of them are pushed back and in between the ribs of the bird. Now, here's where I get somewhat repetitive, using different pictures from different sources and so on to try and, the first concept that you have to keep in your mind with bird breathing is this, is that there are two sets of air sacs in the bird, defined by humans, of course. There's the front air sacs and the rear air sacs. They might also be called the ventral and the dorsal air sacs. There's different names for them. Or anterior and posterior. You see, this is a blue jay up here, and here the person who drew this picture is calling them the front air sacs and the rear air sacs. And this picture of a pigeon down here, the person who drew that has labeled them as the anterior air sacs and the posterior or thoracic air sacs. And so, and then there's also different, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on the air sacs so you understand them. This is just a fun thing that someone put on the internet, and I couldn't help but resist for my students. That it's erroneously believed you can blow a bird up by, they didn't even spell the word there right, by blowing up through its feet. But the fact is, what this does tell you is that birds are actually nothing but big flying organisms of air sacs. That's what they are. But you don't see them, as I said, because they're so, the air sacs are so thin and diaphanous that and when they're deflated, when you open a bird up, you literally do not see them. Now, I'm going to show you something that's very gross, but worth knowing. I suppose all of you have probably seen a robin, American robin, in your life. It's the most common bird in all of North America. And, with the robin redbreast and so on. And so you have a typical image in your mind of the gray bird with the orange breast and so on. Well, sometimes they can get a disease in their air sacs. It's called air saculitis. I'm not sure, it's caused by some sort of organism or whatever. And this was a picture of an American robin that has air saculitis. And there it is right there. And you can see how ugly that is. Here is the main bird of the body right here, the normal part, the legs and so on. And then one of the air sacs at the top of the bird has somehow been diseased and it's inflated the bird grotesquely. Here's the beak up here. Normally that beak would be right about here. It's a very, very awful disease. I have seen other pictures like this. I actually wish I'd shown you a picture of a normal robin with this, because it almost looks like there's another bird hitchhiking the top of another bird. It's pretty ugly. So now we're going to get into it. So this is a picture of a rock pigeon. There used to be called rock doves, and it's your basic city pigeon and so on. And just to give you a little bit of a diagrammatic lesson here, we have here some cervical air sacs. You can see one here and one here on either side of the trachea. They're quite variable from one bird to the next. They don't all look like these, like a pointed finger looking upward. They're various shapes, and sometimes there are more than just two. And then you've got this interclavicular air sac up in the clavicle area of the bird, which basically looks like this. Almost, if you use some imagination, looks like a bull's head there with the horns coming down here on either side. And so that's just a single air sac. They're not paired. And then you've got the anterior thoracic air sac here, and there's another one over here normally. So they're paired. And then you've got the posterior thoracic air sac here and another one here. And then you've got finally down at the bottom here, the abdominal air sacs. They're also paired right here. They're the largest ones. And looking at a side view of the air sac system in the rock pigeon, you've got these cervical air sacs, and you can see if you look at them from a different angle, they look different here, and they're actually showing more of them here in this particular picture. And then you've got the interclavicular air sac on the side here, and then the anterior thoracic air sac sits here. Here are the ribs coming down here of the bird, and then you've got the posterior air sac sitting here, and then back here in the bum area of the bird. This is the Piga style here, where the tail feathers are attached to. And then you've got the abdominal air sacs here, the two of them. And looking at yet even another view, but this one here has something different in it if you look. Here's the trachea coming down right here. Here's the clavicular air sac. You can't see the cervical air sacs, they're up in here. And then you've got the trachea coming down here and then separating into the bronchus right here, one going to one lung and one going to the other. And then here is the lung right here. I showed you right here, like the strawberry mousse right here. And what I want you to note about this is that it's filled with, first of all, it's got a secondary bronchus running through it here, and another one here. And running parallel and joining those two together are a whole bunch, like a whole whack of what are called parabronchi. And they're important because they are where the oxygen carbon dioxide interface is. If you look at this little side diagram here, this is what it looks like, a longitudinal section of the parabronchus. I'm going to be showing you many more pictures of this whole system in a second.
Oh,
now, here's
sorry,
a picture of a parabronchus. Yeah.
Just that previous image. Am I correct in saying that the black arrows going in is fresh oxygenated blood, while the white arrows going out?
Well, that's actually oxygenated air coming in here, that black arrow. See, here's the trachea here. The bird's breathing in, and that's air coming in here into the air sac here.
And then the white arrows going out is the carbon dioxide.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's good point. Good point.
So that's what you mean by unidirectional, in that, like,
Well, I'll really be hammering that home as I go along here, because as I said, to make the students understand this, who are not near as clever as you guys or as educated as you guys, I really had to hammer this home by repetition. So here's a picture of a budgie, okay, showing yet another view of the whole system. Here's the trachea, and the birds, by the way, don't necessarily breathe through their mouth. They have what are known as nares, which I'm surprised actually I don't include in this lecture here. They're two little nose holes like our nostrils, but they don't have noses per se. They have these two little nostrils, and these nostrils actually on the bird can be situated in various locations, at the back of the beak, more down here, more forward on the beak, and so on. Some of them are pointed backwards, some of them are pointed forward, all for different purposes, because they also use their nares to smell. Birds do have a good sense of smell, and much better than we thought, and that they get the molecules coming in of the various aromas through those nares, and also their mouth when they're eating. So here's the trachea coming down here. Here's the clavicular air sac here. Here's a cervical air sac right here. And then this whole structure here is the lung, and there's the secondary bronchi coming into the lung after breaking off the primary bronchus. And then here is one of the two anterior, also known as cranial, meaning cranial toward the head, cranium. And then you've got the posterior thoracic air sac, also known as caudal. So there's about 3 or 4 different terms for these two sets of air sacs. And then you've got the large abdominal air sac here. And of course, these 3 here are paired. The clavicular is not paired, and the cervical, as I said, can vary from, maybe, I'm not sure, well, it'll come up what the variation is like. Now, I'm going to be using the word diverticula a lot. I've already used it once earlier in another way, but diverticula, and I don't know if I have to explain this to you guys, but what they are is basically, they're kind of like side things. If you look at these balloon shapes and so on, all of these things sticking out here like this in different ways that are made by twisting these balloons, would be called diverticulum for short. And they're only important because I'm going to be referring to these air sacs, and some of them have lots of diverticula in them. So in terms of the cranial air sacs, now these are the ones at the top of the bird, toward the brain or toward the cranium. There's 1 to 3 cervical air sacs. So some birds might just have 1, and other birds might have as many as 3. And sometimes these things will have paired diverticula and actually invade the vertebrae. And I'm going to talk about that shortly, about how these the diverticula of these air sacs actually can go right into the bones of the birds. And then the second part of the cranial air sacs is the big one, and there's only one, clavicular air sac. That's the one that was shaped like the bull's head with the horns. And it's quite large and complicated in its shape, and it has 2 diverticula, those 2 horns that stick off to either side of it. And then the third set of air sacs that belong to the cranial air sacs are the cranial or anterior thoracic air sacs, and they don't have any diverticula. They're just sort of round, somewhat like our lungs might be, for example. There's no thing sticking off to the sides or whatever. And then the caudal air sacs, the ones that are found more down the bottom half of the bird, you have, they're also called caudal or posterior thoracic air sacs, and they also have no diverticula as well. And then finally, you've got the largest abdominal air sacs. There's 2 of those, and each of those has 3 paired diverticula going off them. And so if you look at the relative volumes of these air sacs, the thing to note here, this is in milliliters, the number after the word here. So paired cervical have 20 milliliters of air sacs when they're blown up. The singular clavicular is fairly large, 55. The paired cranial thoracic are 50. Now, I guess a question you could ask me, and I don't have the answer, but I'm pretty sure that the 50 represents both of the air sacs together in all cases here. And the biggest one is the paired abdominal. That's 110 milliliters. And the lungs, the 2 paired lungs, only constitute 35 milliliters in terms of size. And the skeleton also has some places for stored oxygen, and that's 4 milliliters. In other words, that's probably where the air sacs invade the skeleton, for a total of almost 300 milliliters of volume of air sacs and lungs in a bird. Okay? Now, I told you that some of these air sacs can actually invade the bones of a bird, and many of the bones in birds are hollow, or they're characterized by pneumatization, meaning that if you look at this bird bone down here, this is one here that's hollow down here, because they need lightness, because these birds are flying. They don't want to be having, the birds that have less hollow type bones would be birds that are divers, birds that have to, like loons and cormorants that want to sink down below like a submarine to go after their food. But a lot of birds that do a lot of flying and have a lot of pneumatization. You can see here that pneumatization is very massive in very powerful flyers like eagles, swans, and albatrosses. They do a lot of soaring as well, where they're not even flapping their wings to save energy, using upwelling currents of air from the waves. Albatrosses can stay up in the air for days and days without ever landing on the ground. Eagles can soar for hours and hours and hours and hours on upwelling thermal pockets of air and so on. And so there's a lot of pneumatization in those powerful flyers. And what a pneumatization really is, it can either be a large opening in a bone called a foramen, or through a whole bunch of smaller holes called pneumatic pores. Very, very tiny, again, looking sort of like frothy looking. And then in swifts and swallows, which are little tiny, tiny birds, which can also stay up in the air they actually claim that they sleep on the wing when they're flying, because they're spending, especially the swifts, spend a lot of their time in the air. They have very, very tiny, tiny feet, almost minimal feet, because they only use those feet when they have to breathe in a chimney or a cavity somewhere. So they are spending all their time, but they're constantly flying. They're not really soarers. And so there's very minimal pneumatization there. So in other words, that isn't really important to them. And then In aquatic birds, as I mentioned earlier, like cormorants and loons, which are divers, or rails, which spend a lot of time walking around on the ground and very rarely flying, except when they need to migrate. And then gulls and ducks, you have hardly any pneumatization at all. And then gannets, which are a diving seabird, they're kind of like they would look like a gull to you, but they have very, very sort of big heads and beaks, pointed beaks. These are the ones that you may have seen on TV diving into the water from, say, about 100 meters up in the air, and then diving right through, crashing through with their beaks pointed forward to catch fish under the water. And if you were out bird watching in the ocean somewhere on an ocean, like a seaside and near a gannet colony, and had the pleasure of seeing these birds diving into the water at some sort of a sudden appearance or sudden bloom of small fish. These things dive, and there's lots of, if you go on the internet, you can look up how gannets dive. Now, the reason I'm mentioning these especially is because they have a lot of pneumatization in the bones around their head area. And the claim is that they have this to act as a cushion when they're diving in straight into the water, but it's not being really proven scientifically. It's just a hypothesis. And overall, there's no really clear relationship. You'll find all sorts of exceptions to all of these different kinds of birds with this pneumatization.
So one thing,
okay, now
the cushioning you mentioned, I was just wondering if that exists for woodpeckers, because they also need some kind of impact.
Well, that's a whole new ball of wax. But very, very quickly with woodpeckers, pneumatization's never mentioned as a possibility for preventing them from getting massive headaches from pounding on on wood and so on, and even metal to make loud noises for courtship. What they have instead is they have a very thin layer of fluid around their brains, and well, we have that too, really. But their brains, believe it or not, instead of being cushioned in a whole bunch of liquid to prevent them from, they're actually tight inside their heads, so they don't get moved back and forth when the bird's pecking on the structure. And they have a number of other things. They have the upper beak and the lower beak are actually capable of working independently, and they also have a hyoid apparatus where their tongue is actually attached to their head inside by a long hyoid apparatus, which actually wraps around their brain. It's attached to their right nostril. If you look that up on the internet, it's pretty cool, but I digress. So getting into the bronchial system. So what you have is you have the trachea, and then the primary bronchus at the syrinx. That's the voice box of the birds where they make their various songs and calls. It can be very, very sophisticated. And this splits to form two extra pulmonary bronchi. The word here, extra, means that they are outside the lungs. They're not yet inside the lungs. So you've got I like to call these, use like superhighways, would be the two extra pulmonary bronchi coming down. And then they enter the lungs at a spot called the hilus. And then they continue on through the lungs, known as intrapulmonary primary bronchi, right to the very caudal end of the lungs. So they don't just join the lungs at the top, they continue right through the lungs, right to the very bottom part of the lungs. And going off the, now we're inside the lungs, off the intrapulmonary bronchi, you have all of these sort of secondary roads going off, or they're technically called secondary bronchi, SBs the reason SBs is because they go off in all different directions. I'm going to explain that in a second here. They don't just all go off laterally like parallel to one another. They go off in different directions. And so you get one group of secondary bronchi called the medioventral. Medioventral would refer to the direction of which they go. For example, they arise off the ventral side. That would be ventral side would be the belly part of the bird, not the back. And so there's 4 to 6 of those, and going off in that direction, and they're the largest ones. And then you've got 7 to 10 mediodorsal ones going off the dorsal wall. That's the back of the bird. So they're going off in that direction. And then you've got 2 to 8 lateral ventral SBs going branching off from across the mediodorsal SB. So it's quite complicated, but the bottom line is that these are all known as secondary bronchi, for which the air flows through in both directions, as you're going to find out. And then what's interesting here to taxonomists, like people trying to decide which birds are related to other birds, you have the lateral, they look at the lateral dorsal secondary bronchi because they are the most variable among all of the 10,000 different kinds of birds. And for example, there are no lateral dorsal secondary bronchi in pigeons. There's a very reduced number in cormorants and storks, and there's a lot of them in fowl like grouse and chickens and so on, and gulls and songbirds. Songbirds being a very, very populous group of birds in the world. So you could look at those things and make a case that, you know, that the pigeons and the doves are related to each other because they have the same number or roughly the same. Now, here's an important thing to remember. The first two groups of secondary bronchi that I told you about, that would be the medioventral and the mediodorsal, form this, they're interconnected to each other to form what is known as the medioventral mediodorsal system, MVMD for short. And another structure that birds have in their breathing system is a paleopulmo. All birds have this. What it is it's a medioventral mediodorsal system is connected to the first 2 or 3 lateral ventral secondary bronchi, if the birds have those. Remember I told you they're absent in pigeons. And that is called a paleopulmo, and I'll explain later on what that does. And in penguins, the paleopulmo actually constitutes the entire lung. But in other birds, it only constitutes about 70 to 80% of the lung of the bird, okay? And then here's the important point that you mentioned earlier, is that the airflow, and this is what's unique to birds, is unidirectional in birds, and also therodont dinosaurs, of which birds are supposed to have evolved from. And now, so we've talked about the main highway, you know, the intrapulmonary, and then we've talked about these secondary roads going off to the side, as I like to call them, or secondary bronchi, and they then give off a whole bunch of small little uniform tubes called parabronchi, and it's in the parabronchi where the oxygen carbon dioxide interface is. And in chickens, there's about 300 to 500 of these parabronchi. I'll be showing you lots of pictures as to what they look like shortly. And they're not unlike us, where we have the blind ending alveoli. In birds, they're not blind ending. They're all interconnected with one another. So that's how you can get this unidirectional airflow. And each parabronchus has an atrium. I'm going to show you pictures of this, so don't panic if you're getting confused, although I bet you're not. They have what is known as an atrium. It's like, you know, an atrium is kind of like if you look at a house, an atrium would be a large room that you enter before. And from that atrium, you have all these little infinite, and this is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide give rise to air capillaries, which intertwine with one another. They're almost like a big bowl of spaghetti. I mean, they're all lying side by side and all intertwined with one another, and also with the blood capillaries. And so the blood capillaries and the air capillaries are actually lying side by side in a big sort of spaghetti-like mass. And that's where the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are exchanged. And so here's a stylized picture from an ornithology textbook showing the inspiration of a package of air. And if you look right here, here's the trachea coming in here, and then here's the interpulmonary bronchus right here, hitting the lungs at the hilus, right? And then carrying on through, and here's the lung here with all of the parabronchi all here like this. Now, keep in mind, this is a stylized diagram. This is like a 2D thing. It's not they're not all running parallel like this. It's more like I told you, it's more spaghetti-like. And here's your cervical air sac here. Here's the big single clavicular air sac right here. And then here's the cranial thoracic air sac here. Remember, those are the anterior air sacs, the front air sacs. And then you've got the abdominal air sac paired here, the two of them here, and also the paired caudal thoracic air sacs here. These two here represent the rear air sacs, or the caudal air sacs. And it's important to remember that. And then you're also going to see here in this picture another feature here called the neopulmonic parabronchi here, connecting the lungs with the abdominal air sac and the caudal thoracic air sac. Those are not found in all birds, as I'm going to explain shortly. So here is another stylized picture from yet another textbook showing the air coming in right here and going through the primary bronchus here and going to the caudal air sacs. Okay, I'm going to explain this really clearly about 7 different ways. So the air goes in here. It doesn't go up here and into the lungs. A little bit does. Like, I forget what the percentage is, but it's like something like 8 to 12% or something. The vast majority of the oxygen-rich air goes in here and goes right back into the caudal air sacs. That's when the bird's breathing in. And then when the bird breathes out that package of air, it doesn't breathe it out of its body, it breathes it into its lungs right here. The stylized thing here is the lung, into those parabronchi where you get the oxygen being applied to the blood and the carbon dioxide removed. All right. So as I mentioned to you earlier in that other picture, there's some birds have what's known as a neopulmo, which is kind of like an intertwining bronchial network in the ventral, that's the belly side, and also lateral means off to the side. So the belly and off to the sides would be like where our ribs are and our bodies and so on, part of the lung. And they're connected to the caudal air sacs, as I showed you in that earlier picture there. Here, right here, see? And so that, as I said, some birds have this, but some don't. It's very well developed in all birds except not the more primitive birds, the ones that are not as far evolved as others. Like, for example, emus, which are related to the ostriches, and penguins, and storks, and cranes, and ducks, and hawks, gulls, and cormorants, and so on. Those do not have, I don't think they have any neopulmo at all. So most birds do, but not those groups. But I don't know why that is. It probably has something to do with the way they transport themselves and need air and oxygen and so on. And just to let you know, to keep the unidirectional flow idea going, the air can flow both ways in the neopulmo, because there's only one way in and one way out, but the air can go both ways in that structure. So here we go back to this diagram again of the air coming in. So as I told you, a little bit of it can go through this passage right here into the lungs, but the vast majority of it goes through, in the birds that have neopulmo, will go through there and into the abdominal air sac. You can see the arrows showing inflation. These things get inflated with that package of air, okay? Now here's a very nice stylized picture showing the parabronchus inside the lungs. And you can see these red things are blood capillaries and the blue things are air capillaries. And you can see they're right beside each other. So the oxygen carbon dioxide interface is going to probably be right along here with the the oxygen going from the air into the blood. I'm going to explain how this happens. There's some very interesting adaptations for this too. And you can see the unidirectional flow, the unidirectional flow of air going right through here and then cutting across. And I'm going to be talking about this cross current thing in another slide shortly.
So I want to just do a quick, a quick time check to say that I can stay longer, but if anyone has to leave, feel free to just drop out without saying anything.
Okay, maybe I should move along a little faster then. I wasn't sure about the time. Okay. And so here's another stylized picture showing the airflow through the parabronchus here. And you can see the blood capillaries and the air spaces and so on. This is, again, a stylized drawing here. This is one where you'd have both right side by side. And so here's a cross section, a drawing from probably a microscopic slide. Here is an air capillary looking right down the barrel of it here, and then here is a blood capillary right here, another one here, looking down the barrel of those. And you can see right here, this is where the air exchange is going to take place. And then here is a microscopic view of the parabronchi in a bird's lung right here, looking pretty cool looking here. And so here is the oxygen carbon dioxide interface right here, and it's exchanged via two systems. And here's where things get a little complicated, but I'll show them very quickly. You have these two exchanges. One's called cross current, and the other one's called counter current. It's actually a subset to the cross current exchange, and it's where the here's the cross current right here. Here's a parabronchus here. There'll be another one up here, another one up here, another all as I said side by side. And here comes an air capillary right here with a blood capillary right here, this black thing here, and it cuts across current this way. And right in here, it's basically dropping off the oxygen and taking away the carbon dioxide. And here's the red blood capillary going away with the red oxygenated blood in it. Here it's the venous, venous. Meaning that carbon dioxide. And here's yet another stylized picture here showing a parabronchus, and here again is the cross current. It's cutting across current here, and right here in these little gray spots here is where the oxygen carbon dioxide interface is. And then here's the counter current subsystem right here, meaning that counter means one current's going one way and another current's going the other way. And so you have the blood flowing this way and the air flowing this way, so they're counter to each other. And right in here is where you get the oxygen being put into the blood and the carbon dioxide being taken away. And so another stylized diagram showing the actual interface here of carbon dioxide going one way, it's diffusion, and the oxygen going the other way. So it all works like this. It's kind of like a continuous system of air movement, and it's not a dead end situation like we have in our lungs. The air sacs actually act like a bellows. You all know what a bellows are, those things that people use to for a fire. A blacksmith would use to pump the air into his fire. And so you have these inspiratory muscles in the bird, and they act to increase the volume of the body cavity and the air sacs, and that it creates a low pressure system. The air enters the mouth and the nares, the nose holes, and passes straight through the lungs and into the caudal air sacs. And then the expiratory muscles reduce the volume of the body cavity, increases pressure in the air sac to force the air out of the caudal air sacs and into the lungs, not out of the bird, but into the lungs where you get the oxygen carbon dioxide exchange taking place. And then the next inspiration forces new air into the caudal air sacs, and then the air in the lungs goes into the cranial air sacs. Okay, and the next breath in, and then the next breath out forces the air that's in the caudal sacs into out of the bird, and explain again. The next second breath out forces the air that's in the caudal air sacs into the lungs, and the air that's in the cranial air sacs out of the body. So it's a two-breath system. And here it is right here. This is a picture here showing cycle one. This shows the whiteness shows the air coming in to the bird. Now, obviously, it's not coming through a hole in its breast. So this is just a stylized picture of a bird. But you can see the whiteness there shows the air coming in, and you see a little bit of it goes into the lungs. Then the bird breathes out, and the air that's in the posterior air sacs now goes into the lung to be treated. And then in the next breath in, the air that was in the lungs goes into the anterior air sacs. Meanwhile, another bunch of air goes into the posterior air sacs, of course. And then on the second breath out, the air that's in the anterior air sacs goes out of the bird. Meanwhile, the air that's in the posterior air sacs goes into the lungs. And so here's another picture here showing the air going in, going right back to the posterior air sacs, and then in the next breath out into the lungs. Next breath in goes into the anterior sacs, and then the next breath out, it goes out of the bird. And this is just another stylized picture. We've seen it earlier, whatever, explaining the same thing. And here's a drawing that I did for the students, whatever, a very, 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 very rough drawing showing the air coming in and going right down to the posterior sacs. Then the next breath out goes into the lungs. Next breath in, it goes, the stuff in the lungs goes to the anterior sac, and the next breath out, it goes out of the bird. So it's essentially a 2-breath system. For each volume of air inhaled, it takes 2 inspirations and 2 expirations to process it. And then an interesting fact, breathing rates per minute. These are birds at rest. In an ostrich, 5 breaths a minute in the ostrich. In a resting duck, sort of what a duck just sort of bobbing around on the surface of the water, 14 breaths a minute, but when it's flying, goes up to 96 in a flying duck. And the others are 26, 23, and average birds like pigeons and chickens. In a wren, it's a little tiny little bird, very, very active, 100 breaths a minute, and a hummingbird, 250 breaths a minute. Whereas our breathing is about 20 to 30 if you're a 165-pound human. So how many people have I still got with me right now? Is everybody still with me? Or do you all have to go? Y'all here? I'll go through this really. Do you want to hear this, or would you rather quit right now? This won't take long. Yeah, okay. Please go ahead. Well, I know that even if there's just one of you left, I'll explain it to you. You'll find it quite interesting. The diving birds, there's 174 families of birds in the world, 15 if you include the little dipper. That's a little bird down below that likes to walk underneath the water of fast-flowing trout streams. They all are capable of diving. And I'm not going to bore you with the coloration thing because it all has to do with camouflage, not being, basically if you look at a lot of diving birds, they're black and white or brown and white or whatever. And it's because they avoid predation, and they get undetected by the prey because of their coloration, depending on whether they're being looked at from above or below. Now, here's what gets interesting. There's 2 kinds of diving behavior in birds, 2 strategies. One is plunge diving and the other one is surface diving. And there's a picture on the bottom left right here of a gannet folding its wings back and pounding into the water with a straight, probably a lot of pneumatization right here for shock absorbers. And then here is another bird here. This is a cormorant, which dives below the surface. It does surface diving. This guy's doing plunge diving. Kingfishers do plunge diving. They jump right off a perch, smack into the water. And these little guys here basically just tip their heads down and dive underneath the water. And interesting enough, the cormorant has a very interesting adaptation to help it go below, because they spend a lot of time under the water seeking fish. Their main feathers on their wings are hollow, so they can fill them up with water. And don't ask me how they do that, but they fill them up with water to make their wings very heavy, and it allows them to go underneath the water like ballast in a submarine. And then when they're finished feeding, they go up and sit on a rock and stretch their wings out, both for sunbathing, but also to drain their wing feathers. They're one of the few birds that have that. And so in terms of being underwater, 2 basic methods. There's wing flapping and paddling with the feet. I don't know if birds use both. Maybe some do, but by and large, these are 2 different kinds of ways. And they've got all these different head adaptations right here to allow them to be under the water and everything from, I mentioned the shock absorption of the air sacs and the gannets is a possibility. They have special adaptations for their eyes so they can see underwater. And they have buoyancy adaptations, relatively solid bones. Some of them actually swallow stones for ballast to make them be allowed to go under the water. I mentioned the hollow feathers and so on. And then they have various leg adaptations, lobed or webbed feet, laterally flattened tarsi, so they don't, you couldn't picture a stork swimming underneath water with those big long legs, and so on and so forth. And then they also have lots of, if they're a bird that lives in cold water, lots of thick layers of fat, thick oily plumage, oil glands for waterproofing and conditioning, and so on. And then they have various wing adaptations, because when you're underneath the water and you're using your wings, you're going to use different, there's 2 main flight muscles, you're going to be using them in a different ratio, because you want to have stronger, you want to be able to lift your wing in that dense water medium. So here, coming to the respiratory adaptations, there's 2 basic pre-dive respiration patterns in birds. The penguins hyperventilate, and then they inspire deeply before diving. The tufted ducks, like this guy here, a little tuft in the back of his head, they hyperventilate, but they expire deeply before they dive. And so they've also got some cardiovascular adaptations. They've got to conserve oxygen because some of them stay under the water for quite a long time. And so they can actually decrease their heart rate. They decrease their cardiac output. They can actually pool their blood in the viscera area, and they can even undergo peripheral vasoconstriction in their limbs and so on to shunt the blood to the heart and the brain, because they got to keep those 2 things working really, really big time. And so each species there has various adjustments, and each individual has its own physiological limits, just like there are free divers that can stay under the water for 5 minutes, where I can only make it for a minute. And so where do they store oxygen? Well, in the respiratory system that I've explained, in their blood. Some of it's stored in myoglobin and skeletal muscles, and some birds actually have anaerobic metabolism, where they accumulate lactic acid, which is later dissipated during aerobic metabolism. Some of the diving records are emperor penguin, 1,772 feet, and these have probably even been broken now. That's a non-flying bird. For a flying bird, the thick-billed mirror, one of them has been found at almost 700 feet below the surface. The deepest dive for a flying bird is the Peruvian diving petrel, 272 feet. That's a bird under 210 grams. That's like a half a pound. And then the longest submergent that's known out there is the emperor penguin at 18 minutes. So that is basically it.
Your autograph is worth 5 cents?
Well, that's just a joke. Whenever I'm selling books and giving talks, I say that the book is, I'm selling it for $24.95, 5 cents for the autograph. I'm glad you picked up on that. Anyway, that's how it goes, guys.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for sharing it in such detail.
Yeah.
So I do have some additional questions if you're okay with staying on.
Go right ahead. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this area, so I hope I can answer them.
Okay. Well, so the first one's rather broad. I would say that because we could see that birds have to breathe a lot more than humans.
Yep.
How have they been affected by air pollution compared to other animals?
Well, that is a very, very good question to ask, and a very difficult one to answer, because I've studied toxicology and birds of prey almost all my life. Everything from flame retardant chemicals to DDT, not so much polluted air. And to be honest with you, there probably are some scientific papers out there, but I have many toxicology friends, avian toxicologists, and we very, very seldom ever talk about polluted air. We talk about them picking up chemicals through their food, the food system, like DDT, and biomagnifying 10 times at each ecological level, whatever. But, you know, polluted air is another issue altogether. And I would imagine that, you know, if for a forest fire, those brush fires, there was a whole big die-off of birds, little birds literally falling out of the sky. This was just within a year ago with those brush fires in California. And a lot of people were trying to equate their deaths to breathing in the heavy smoke or whatever. But some studies were done, like some necropsies were done on some of the dead birds. And a lot of them were dead for other reasons. They basically had lost all their food sources because of the brush fires. And they're literally becoming feathered skeletons and dying with like no meat on their bones at all. So that's about the best answer I can give you, Patrick.
Okay, yeah. So going back to the actual physiological side, you mentioned the two-part breathing. I'm just still trying to wrap my head around that. When you inhale, there's air coming into your body from the outside. Yeah. And then exhale, for us, exhale, it comes back out. But in this case, it sounds like they inhale, the air goes into those back sacs. Yeah. And then, but the next inhale, is there still air coming in from the outside, or is it doing that other function of? That's a
good question. That's a concept that the students always had a hard time with. In fact, even I have a hard time with it. Obviously, when the bird's breathing in, the second breath, like in other words, it's breathed in, and you have to look at it in terms of packages of air. So when it breathes in, a package of air goes into well, we won't talk about the little bit that goes in the lungs, but it goes into the Cranial Air Sacs. And then when it breathes out, that package of air goes into the lungs. Meanwhile, there's already a package of air that's in the anterior air sacs that goes out. So you have to try and keep in mind that there are obviously air in different sections being processed in the bird. That's the way you've got to think about this.
Okay, so those.
Does that help?
Yeah, they're simultaneous. So
Yes, they
the
are. Yes.
outside air into the caudal air sacs is happening at the same time as
Yes.
the
Yes.
lung air going into.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Peter has a question.
So is this to prep the air? So humans have that sort of small, or golf ball, or if you breathe in your nose, you humidify the air going into the lungs much more efficiently. Is this kind of the same? Like, is it going through a sort of like those air sacs are really more kind of prepping with humidity, or is it like this is sort of an adaptation that's
yeah.
It seems
That's
like
a really
it's
good question. That's a really good question, Peter. And I think you'd have to get that analyst in Avian for years. And but I haven't gone to very many very serious theology conferences where they were talking to things like that. And I've used for my teachings over the years, and including this one right here. I don't know if you can see this. It's called the Handbook of Bird Biology, and it's actually part of a course that people can take, like yourselves. If you wanted to do a course in ornithology, you could take a course at Cornell University, and you'd have to buy this very, very expensive book. And it doesn't mention anything at all about humidity in the breathing system of a bird. And so I'm sure there's probably something in there. And if you talk to a specialist, he'd probably tell you, oh yeah, because I think I remember I told you at the beginning that those long distance flyers like whooping cranes, for example, have those great big, huge, long trachea that snake all through their necks or whatever, almost an S shape and so on. And part of the reason they have those is to warm the inhaled air, because they're flying sometimes at very high altitudes where it's quite cold. So that's the best answer I can give you.
Anyone have any other questions? Ron, did you have something?
Let Helene go. She has a question first.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, I came in late. I had computer issues, so very sorry for missing the beginning.
Okay. Well, that's too bad. I'm sorry to hear that.
It's okay. I got the most important part, so thank you for coming today.
Okay, good.
But my question is, so I'm also a professor and I teach poultry management, so I know a little bit about birds and their physiology, but there's always this contention about the advantage of this non-tidal respiratory system where it's always fresh air going into the lungs. So the advantage is that they can extract a huge amount of oxygen and get rid of a large amount of CO2 in a very short period of time. But which may make sense, but there's some people that do not agree with that. Do you know more about why that would be?
No, I don't actually. And you have to understand that I retired in 2013, which was 8 years ago. And, and I have to admit that I wasn't reading up on papers on avian respiration. I'm guilty of being like most professors, and the basics are still there. That hasn't changed, the basic system. But I did not, because it didn't interest me as much. I was much more interested in reproductive physiology and feathers and eggs and all that kind of stuff. I didn't go in the literature and look in physiology textbooks, because the thing is, when people publish papers on avian respiration, they're not likely going to publish it in an ornithology journal. They're going to publish it in some very, very high-level physiology journal, because physiologists would have the most interest in that. And so, and I don't even know if maybe there haven't been any new findings in it, but I suspect there, like you say, there probably has. But I think the basics of the two-breath system, the unidirectional airflow, are the main adaptations for birds that make them so different from us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Ron?
Did I explain the system reasonably well? I felt good about it from this end. In fact, it's probably one of the best lectures I've ever given on avian respiration, to be honest with you. But I knew I was talking to a very intellectual crowd, so I could, but I felt pretty good about it for 6 o'clock in the morning. I didn't think I did too bad.
Like you were saying, the repetition and all the diagrams was very helpful in seeing it.
Good. That's good. Yeah.
Unless Ron has another question, I do have something that I want to ask you while we have you here. Ron, did you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to read to you, I transcribed just a short paragraph from an interview with someone who published a book. It's called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Now, this is, he stated in the interview, he said, talking about birds who have their eyes on the side of their head, unlike us having them in the front. He said,
except for owls, they're not on the side of their head.
Yeah.
Okay.
They use the left hemisphere's field of vision to target things that they need. It's for grabbing, for getting prey, for picking up seed, such as a bird picking it up from a background of gravel before another bird does, picking up a twig to make a nest. All these things it uses the left hemisphere for. But for all the rest, for keeping a lookout for what else is going on in the world around them. Are there enemies nearby? Is that my mate who I need to welcome into the situation? All of that is taken care of by the right hemisphere. So my wife and I became kind of, amateur bird watchers this year. And, and, watching the birds, I keep seeing them, seems like they're oriented like the left eye for something and the right eye for something like that. So is your understanding that the birds use their left and right eyes for distinctly different functions?
That would be a fairly recent finding. I do in my lectures on ornithology and even to the general public, because I offer a course with my buddy, my old ornithology co-professor. We do a thing called the bird course, and depending on how much, whether we're going for a weekend, like we're actually doing a version of it this spring, and it's on over 2 Saturdays, and the lectures are all like this, like I just gave you, and I sometimes include this one because, but it's the one that I would be least likely to include because of the sophistication of it. And I do have a lecture on sensory ecology. One that I aim at the general public that has lots of funny slides in it and so on, but I have a more serious one for the bird course. And to be frank with you, the whole idea of the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, they are constantly coming up with new studies on how birds perceive things. And even things like, do birds, like the corvids, which are the crows, the ravens, the magpies, and the jays, are in my books the smartest birds in the world. But if you talk to a parrot person, they'll tell you that the parrots are. But it all depends on, if you look at those two groups of birds, how you're measuring intelligence. If it's for innovative behavior in the wild, doing things like crows dropping hard nuts like walnuts on the pavement, at a traffic light so cars can drive over them and crack them open, and then even waiting till someone presses the green light for crossing so they can safely go out and get the nuts. I mean, that's a very, very strong innovative behavior. Whereas the parrot people are relying more on Irene Pepperberg's studies with her famous parrot Alex, who's now deceased. She has a new one now. She's got a book out on the subject. It's fascinating. I know Irene personally. And he was able to pick out, the odd object and all sorts of things and communicate with her. But there are psychologists out there that believe that the parrots are merely, pardon the expression, parroting her or mimicking her. But again, you could argue back and forth, and it would be fun to be at a conference where the crow people were arguing with actually, what a great idea that would be to have them going at it. So coming back to your question, the whole idea of right hemispheres and left hemispheres, and birds basically sleeping on the wing versus sitting on a perch. When birds sleep at nighttime, apparently they sleep with one eye open because, a little bird sitting there is quite vulnerable to any kind of predator, like a climbing weasel or a raccoon or an owl or whatever. So bottom line is I don't know the answer to your question, but I know it's quite complex. and the whole idea of handedness. You know, I'm left-handed, my wife's left-handed, our 2 kids are right-handed. So what's going on there? And I've actually studied handedness, or we could call it footedness, in falcons, where we actually looked at a whole whack of these little falcons I studied for 40 years, and to see which foot they favored. And I found out that it was about 50-50. Some of them favored the left and some of them favored the right for grabbing things. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Ronald, but it's the best I can do.
Thank you.
It's very interesting, though.
Yeah, so my last question is actually related to this choice of birds, specifically your involvement with the selection of Canada's national bird. I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about the debates around how that was chosen.
You know, you're pressing a button there that you might not want to press, because I could talk for a long time about this, but in a nutshell, and I know there's a question that a lot of you haven't asked me, and I'm surprised you haven't asked me, is did my name have anything to do with my profession? I've been asked that by virtually every media person, save for maybe 2 or 3 in my 40-year career. And the answer is it had nothing to do with it whatsoever. I got interested in birds very quickly through a childhood interest in falconry. I wanted to train falcons to hunt because I love birds of prey, and I wanted to have a bird, an animal of my own, a wild animal of my own. And I never did get to become a falconer, but then I went through the teenage thing with the girls, the fast cars, and money to pay for those things, and got sidetracked. I actually went to the University of Waterloo for a semester to be an automotive engineer, to design racing cars for the fast cars, the fast women, and the money. And I was so unhappy within 1 month. I had no brains at all to be an engineer. And I was constantly parasitizing my geeky friends to get answers to questions. I found a calendar for, and I'll come back to your national bird thing in a second. I found a calendar for the University of Guelph, 20 miles away, for wildlife biology. And I went there and enrolled in zoology. Then the whole birds of prey thing, the falcon thing, came back. Birds of prey were in trouble because of DDT. And then I got so engrossed in birds. And then the reason I like all birds now, and not just birds of prey, is because I once saw an Anna's hummingbird with this beautiful neon pink throat area doing this display like a diamond in the sky. And I went back, and I was writing a bird column for the Montreal Gazette for 28 years. And I went back and said, I don't want to be a raptor, which means bird of prey, bigot anymore. I want to like all birds. I'm going to appreciate all birds. So coming back to the national bird thing, the Americans have the bald eagle, of course. I mean, you revere the bald eagle down there for its fierceness and its beauty. Although I will tell you, I've seen them waiting in town dumps in Vancouver in the garbage with gulls, and bringing up garbage bags full of human refuse to their nests to feed their young. So not necessarily, and also stealing food from ospreys. But anyway, I still think it's a wonderful choice, and it's doing very well now in your country. So you have, you know, you fly trained bald eagles at Super Bowl, Indy 500, World Series, and so on. So you have one, and you had it for since the 1700s. We in Canada do not have a national bird. All of the states and provinces have their own bird, like all of your states have them. All of our provinces and territories have one. And so there was a contest held about 5 years ago, and the bird that came in 3rd place was then called the gray jay. It used to be called the Canada jay, and we've now convinced the ornithology committee to change the name back to Canada jay, not because we want it for our national bird, just because it was a mistake. It was mistakenly changed to gray jay years ago in 1957. And so all this to say, the Canada jay is a perfect bird for Canadians because it is a member of the corvid family, the smart crows, ravens, and magpies and jays. Secondly, it's extremely friendly, curious, and trusting. It will land on your hand, your head, or whatever, even if you don't even have any food, as long as you're being calm at a ski hill or a hiking trail. It is looking for food. They're not dumb, as I told you. They're also very hardy birds. They don't migrate. They stay in Canada year-round, and they will sit on their eggs at -30 below Celsius, covered in snow. So they're really tough. So now you've got intelligent, friendly, and tough, and also their range practically mirrors our borders. You get a few of them into Alaska, quite a few into Alaska actually, and some down in the Rocky Mountains in the States, and a few in the northeastern states and so on. But by and large, you could not find a more Canadian bird than the Canada jay. And so where we're at with it right now, we've got a website. If you want to read more about it, go to www.canadaj, all one word.org. Or we've got a new book coming out in May, an argument book saying, which we're going to send to politicians, because we need to convince the federal government to do what you guys did in the 1700s, to make it an official symbol of Canadians.
Just
I can't believe you guys are so happy.
You mentioned it was the third place. So what came above it?
Well, here's what happened in a nutshell. They had this national contest, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, which is a society of high-profile scientists across Canada. They have a magazine called Canadian Geographic, something like your National Geographic, but not quite as sophisticated, but pretty nice magazine. And so they held a contest to see, just to foment discussion among Canadians, if we're going to have a national bird, what would it be? And they made two mistakes. One of them is they included some or all of the birds that were already taken as provincial birds and territorial birds. I would never have done that, because they're taken. They're already represented and glorified in Canadian history. And then they also did not confer with the federal government. They didn't bring the government in the get-go. So the government didn't feel that this was their thing. And so what happened is that in terms of the votes, the common loon, which was the Ontario's bird, and that's our most populous province, so the big voting block there as well, came in first place easily. And I knew it would, because I love common loons, but it's already on our coin, the loonie, and it's already Ontario's bird. And then the second place bird was a snowy owl, which is Quebec's bird. I helped make it so to help protect it from shooting. And then the gray jay, then called the gray jay, came in third place because of an essay I wrote giving 13 reasons why this is a great bird. I've only given you 4 or 5, but there's actually quite a few others. And so it got into solid third place. And so the committee had to look at these results and say, well, geez, do we really want to elevate the common loon to national status? Because that's going to piss off the Quebec people and their snowy owl. And do we really want to elevate the beautiful white snowy owl? Because that's going to piss off the Ontario people. So let's go for the third place bird, which is fresh and new. And my argument was in a national debate is that when we chose our flag in Canada in 1975, we didn't elevate Ontario's flag. We didn't elevate Quebec's flag. We chose something, as I say, fresh and new, our own design. And I feel the very, very same way about the bird. So it won the contest, but the federal government didn't follow up because it wasn't their project, and they didn't like the fact that they didn't follow due democratic process and choose the bird with the most votes. And so then everything devolved into a chaotic, to use that word chaos, mess with the media. And, I was constantly going on the media defending, why this bird, why didn't you pick the loon? It won the most votes and so on. And I held my own pretty good, but the federal government, basically the head guy, Trudeau, sent a message. We found this out later on to all his ministers saying, don't touch this. We got enough controversy in our lives without getting controversial over a frivolous thing like this. And because of COVID right now, I can't even think about calling upon the federal government to follow up in this process when people are dying from COVID and also suffering from economic meltdowns. And so we're waiting till maybe 2022 for Canada Day, July 1st, and hoping with the book, the website, we have a petition called change.org that people can, we got about 12,000 people on it right now. And we're hoping with all those tools in the box and maybe even a Senate motion by a senator who's interested in our cause, those things might help us convince the government to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all those resources, because I remember that time. So I'm in Ontario, and I voted.
Canadian. I'm a Canadian. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, we have 2 people here from Canada. Yeah.
Oh, you too, Peter. Okay.
Yeah.
I voted for the Canada Jay, actually, because I just come back from Whistler, and I saw at that time I know them as the Whiskey Jack. And
yes, that's the other name. Yeah.
Yeah, so I saw them up there and I was like, yeah, this is a marvelous bird. And I'm not too big of a fan of a loon, so yeah, hopefully we can get that.
Something people don't know about loons is that they're actually, besides the fact that they're not hardy like Canada Jays / Whiskey Jacks, they leave in the wintertime to go south escape the cold winters. They're snowbirds. And the Canada jays are not, and of course, and they also are very aggressive on a lake. They are commonly known to kill other birds. Now, don't get me wrong, Canada jays will also eat nestlings and eggs of other birds too to survive, like corvids do. But, you know, common loons are not as nice of birds as you think. They spear other birds to death with their beaks, so they're kind of nasty, really. But, you know, a lovely bird all the same. I think Peter has a question, right?
How can we not vote in a Canadian whiskey jack? Like, that is even more Canadian.
I know, but you're mixing two things up right now. First of all, the name whiskey jack has nothing to do with the popular beverage. I'm a Scotch drinker myself. It's got nothing to do with it. In fact, I really like to disconnect those two things because of the very fact that our First Nations people are thoroughly inundated with cases of alcoholism, which killed my father. And so, you know, we really don't want to bring that association there. The only real connection is it was actually believed for a long time, until just within a year ago, that the name whiskey jack came from an anglicized Cree word that means mischievous prankster or trickster, a god that some of the tribes worship. But it's now being poo-pooed now, and it has nothing to do with that particular word, but another word called wiskikak, which is a Cree word. It doesn't have any meaning that I know of or whatever, but that mischievous prankster thing, the reason it gets that is because it's also known as the campground robber or camp robber, because it will commonly steal your granola bars from your pack sacks and so on if you're not looking, or even go into your kitchen pantry of a cookhouse at a logging camp and steal food. So they're pretty clever birds.
Great.
I'm glad you like the bird. It's a great bird. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing all this. It was a fascinating conversation.
Well, I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. I didn't think I would enjoy talking about this complex subject at 6 o'clock in the morning. But to be frank with you, I had a really, really good time. I really enjoyed this, and it's nice to talk with fellow academics who can appreciate you know, the workings of interesting creatures like birds. Well, thanks for inviting me, Patrick. Yeah, all of you stay safe. Wear a mask, socially distant. The vaccines are not going to save us from everything necessarily. So you keep doing your thing.
Thank you. Yes, everyone do that.
Right.
All right. So thank you so much.
Have a great day, guys.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode, because we have a lot more exciting conversations to share as we explore the world of the traditional Japanese martial arts. The Inside Look podcast is brought to you by our amazing patrons over at Patreon. If you are enjoying this work, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/Tokuskai Canada. To contribute to this effort, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at tokuskai.canada, or subscribe to our newsletter at subscribe@tokuskai.ca. Until next time, thanks for listening.